Hello everyone, we're going to talk about driving question. Several of you have had questions about what a driving question is, which is, ironic. But we're going to go ahead and answer that today by addressing what a driving question is, why it's important for your story plot, and how you can use it in your story. Now, a driving question is something that every single story always must have. A driving question is always simple, and it's something that can be answered in the course of one story. So, for example, in Gone with the Wind, will Scarlett marry Ashley, right? Or in Indiana Jones, will Indiana Jones get the Holy Grail? The question is very simple, it's something that can be easily answered, and it's something that the whole story is shaped around and by. The whole story is shaped by the driving question. So it's never something that's too big or too ambiguous. It's never something like, will there ever be world peace? Or something like, will I find happiness, right? Those are big questions. Those are questions that people might call life questions that aren't necessarily answerable or attainable in a concrete way. This story arc needs to have a concrete, answerable, short, small question. So also if you're writing creative nonfiction, like a memoir, pick a chapter of your life where a small question can be answered. That's one of the roles as a storyteller, is to explore within ourselves or explore with our characters. So the whole objective is to have a question that you then answer. So back to fiction, we have the story arc, and the driving question needs to be answered in here. This is in many ways the introduction, but it's also called the exposition, right? Exposition is a word for describing prose. It's often also used to describe the introduction because you're introducing your main character. Nothing has really happened yet. The point at which it happens is right here in the rising action, right before it starts to propel towards the climax. But before we get to that point, we need to know who your main character is. Right? We need to be introduced to the main character. We need to get a sense of characterization. And in that introduction is when we find out what your character's driving question is. They need to have some problem of some kind that needs to be solved. And that's what we establish here. So I'm just going to do this and DQ, just like ice cream. Just kidding. So your driving question needs to be in that introduction, right? Because what happens is you get to the climax of the story, right? We all remember from being in third grade, the climax of the story is the most interesting part, but nobody tells you why it's the most interesting part. The reason it's the most interesting part is because your driving question is answered, right? So in Gone with the Wind, we get to the climax of the story. We know that Scarlett isn't going to marry Ashley, and then, once that question is answered, then we have this falling action here. The falling action is the consequences of that answer. So the falling action in Gone with the Wind is, okay, well now I know I'm not going to marry Ashley, so what are the consequences? Can I get to Rhett in time before he leaves, etc., etc. You might want to argue that Gone with the Wind has no resolution, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have falling action. Indiana Jones, which was my other example. You know that he's in the room with the old, 500-year-old knight, or however old he is. Oh, you chose wisely, you chose poorly, whatever he says. You know in that moment that your question is going to be answered because he's in the room with all these different grails, right? And then once he picks the right one, you chose wisely, and then he takes it to his dad, and then the rest of the story can then continue in this falling action because we know the answer. We know that, yes, he does find the Holy Grail. So every story is shaped with this very simple objective. Have a question, answer the question. It's very simple. Every story has to do that. So if you don't know what your driving question is, ask yourself if you really know who your main character is. Because if your characterization is very closely tied to your driving question, if you don't know your character well, then you might even pick the wrong driving question. And that's part of what revising and going through multiple drafts helps you to see. So one struggle that you might think your character is going through might be a completely different struggle, and so you might need to revise it and try a different driving question. Now, I gave you a lot of comments back on your stories. You know, a couple of you struggle with what your driving question is. So take a look at your story. What is the plot? A lot of these scenes in here in the rising action, they have to be tied to your driving question. Otherwise, they don't belong in the story. So as your driving question is working up toward the climax, the tension needs to be getting higher. The conflict needs to be getting higher. And therefore, you can ask yourself, if tension isn't getting high, is this scene valuable? And if it's not valuable, take it out. So each scene that goes up toward the climax has to be related to that driving question. So if you have any more questions, again, ironic, be sure to send me an email.